Hello and welcome to PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm your host, Ian Hartitz, and today we continue the Fantasy Files series with a look at some low ADP receivers that I think have the potential for triple-digit targets. Usually with this series, I've been doing the quarterback, the backfield, and the pass game options for every team. This was actually the Detroit Lions receiving crew, but I did not want to devote an entire article to Brashad Perryman, Tyrell Williams, Amon-Ra St. Brown, that whole group of guys. So with all due respect to them, hope they ball out. They are not in this article. It's just so freaking unclear what's going on in Detroit outside of TJ Hawkinson and to an extent DeAndre Swift and Jamal Williams. So go get those auxiliary guys, but that's the rest of what we're talking about, the Detroit Lions passing game here on this edition of the PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. Because basically, people, I love these fantasy files. It gives us a good chance to go through, just very specifically each team and give them, I think, the appropriate due. But I also recognize that, sometimes we need to combine teams and make things a little bit easier for you as you start getting in drafts. So with that in mind, I have 10 wide receivers that I believe have the potential for triple-digit targets and are currently priced outside of the top 36. Usually we define a wide receiver 1 as a wide receiver that finishes in the top 12 base, league size. Wide receiver 2, top 24. Wide receiver 3 would be wide receiver 25 through wide receiver 36. So last year, in terms of the top 30, outside the top 30, we saw 8 guys actually finish with over 100 targets, and they were Tyler Boyd as the wide receiver 33 preseason. Brandin Cooks was the wide receiver 34. Deontay Johnson, wide receiver 37. CeeDee Lamb, wide receiver 38. Marvin Jones, wide receiver 39. Jerry Judy, wide receiver 45. Justin Jefferson, wide receiver 49. And all the way down at wide receiver 65, Robbie Anderson. So those are the type of guys that we're hoping to identify here. And it's pretty easy to spot some of the commonalities out of the group. Lamb, Judy, and Jefferson were first-round rookies in fairly crowded offenses that won anyway because they're really freaking good. Boyd, Deontay, and Marvin Jones were incumbent number 2 receivers that faced some newfound competition in the pass game. That's why we were down on them. We had T. Higgins join the Bengals. Steelers had Claypool and Juju soaking up targets. Marvin Jones, he was behind Kenny Golladay, kind of caught a break with him getting hurt. And then Brandin Cooks and Robbie Anderson had to adjust to life with the new team. Historically not great. Credit to them for being able to overcome that with flying colors. Every single one of these players beat their average draft position except Jerry Judy. He finished as a wide receiver 46, was drafted as a wide receiver 45. I think you all can see, what having this sort of volume can do for your fantasy football floor. So I'm going to bump it down to just outside the top 36. Again, I listed the top outside the top 30 from last year. Only reason because literally every single receiver with an ADP between wide receiver 30 and 36, I think will qualify for that. They are Devonte Smith, Cortland Sutton, Juju Smith-Schuster, Tyler Boyd, Deebo Samuel, and Robbie Anderson. So yeah, I think those guys are great values at where they're going and have that sky-high target upside. These 10 receivers, though, who I think are way further down the average draft position and have a much better opportunity. Not a better opportunity than those other guys, just a great opportunity to get triple-digit targets. So without further ado, let's get into them. Starting with Houston Texans wide receiver Brandin Cooks, current ADP, and these are courtesy of Fantasy Football Calculator. Wide receiver 39, and PFF gives him 114 target projection ahead of 2021. For those counting at home, we're looking at 106 targets. That would be the that would be the 17-game pace of someone normally getting 100 targets in a 16-game season. So got to keep that in mind with this. But look, Brandin Cooks qualifies. He is the only receiver expected to really get fed the ball in Houston. We don't know what his quarterback situation is going to be. It's a little alarming that the one down season we've seen him have came with the bad version of Jared Goff. But when he's this cheap, people, his only 5 career seasons where he played at least 15 games, which is fair, 5 of 7 seasons. I know the concussion history is scary, but that doesn't mean Cooks hasn't been out there more times than not. He's posted PPR wide receiver 14, wide receiver 10, wide receiver 15, wide receiver 13, most recently wide receiver 17 finishes. So I realize, we got Breeze, Brady, Watson, Goff. Those are the guys he's been catching passes from. Likely not going to be that situation, but, I think he's still just 27 years old, and the way he was used in Houston last year, more in a low ADOT role than we've seen in the past. I think Cooks still presents value at his current ADP. Jarvis Landry comes in as the wide receiver 40 with an 108.6 target projection courtesy of PFF. Again, people, he's going to be at worst the number 2 pass game option inside of an extending Browns offense. If Baker Mayfield is as good as a lot of us think he could be this year, if he keeps things moving forward, I mean, Landry is going to push for triple-digit targets and likely have some better touchdown upside. You know, for him to not even miss a game last year despite having that late hip surgery, I think spoke, you know, just to his general toughness, and that's the guy he's been throughout his entire career. I mean, Landry just continues to basically beat his, preseason draft position. He has actually never posted a season-long PPR finish more than one spot worse than his preseason ADP, basically like Judy. With Jarvis Landry, I'm not saying we're getting a league winner here, but at his current ADP, I think it makes sense if he could, again, come in as more of a low-end wide receiver 3 versus the wide receiver 4 he's being priced at. Moving on down, we got Cole Beasley, ADP wide receiver 48, coming in with 102 target projection. He's had 105 and 106 targets over the past 2 seasons, and he's still locked in as Josh Allen's number 2 receiver. Maybe you don't like why he's been making headlines, this offseason. That doesn't mean that PFF's reigning 8th highest graded receiver is anything other than great when he's on the football field. And don't fall into the, he's a small white guy who doesn't have upside trap. Last year, only Calvin Ridley, Devonte Adams, Stephon Diggs, DeAndre Hopkins, Justin Jefferson, Travis Kelce had more games with at least 100 receiving yards. He went triple digits 5 times, people. Absolute madness. Again, we have Josh Allen's number 2 wide receiver at a discount. Gotta love it. Jerry Judy once again qualifies for this list, coming in at the wide receiver 38 with a target projection of 105. Sutton will be back, but hey, it seems like Teddy Bridgewater is trending towards getting this job. And I'll tell you what, as much as I stand and love Drew Lock, Teddy would be better news for Judy, just in terms of him being able to get the ball to Judy when he's open, which seems to be all the freaking time. I've talked about my just overall hatred for the drop leaderboards. Again, it represents people being open, not necessarily guys that suck at catching the ball. If you're not holding that against Jerry Judy, you shouldn't be holding it against Deontay Johnson or DK Metcalf either. And I mean, just looking at the entire drop leaderboard, like let's not focus on just 2020. Let's not focus on just 2020. Let's go back. This is 2019. The leaders in drops: DK Metcalf, Michael Gallup, Deontay Johnson, Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs, Mike Evans. Again, it's more of a volume stat, not a stat worthy of fading receivers. So last year, only wide receiver that was probably more unlucky than Judy, had a big article go out about this earlier in the offseason. It was DJ Moore. So the fact Judy is getting DJ Moore's ex-quarterback, not the best thing, but DJ was being used so much more as a field stretcher last year. And I think Judy would be more of the Robbie Anderson in this type of offense. So, Bridgewater, I think, wasn't bad last year. He enabled 4 players to get over 1,000 yards. I wouldn't be surprised if Judy could be one of those guys this year in 2021. The Dolphins honestly have 3 qualifiers. This offense is wide open. Will Fuller has a wide receiver 37 ADP. Waddle's at wide receiver 47. Devontae Parker is at wide receiver 46. Waddle's been the guy that I just want more and more of, everybody. I have him ranked as my wide receiver 32 right now, ahead of Fuller, ahead of Devontae Parker. I mean, they just used the number 6 pick on the guy. He has the familiarity with Tua. I mean, it's a crowded wide receiver room. Preston Williams, Albert Wilson, Jakeem Grant are going to be there too. But Waddle, to our knowledge, is now fully healthy, and he's going to be out there from day one. I mean, I think the biggest thing that Waddle affects is going to be Mike Gesicki, who's no longer going to be the starting slot receiver, which is a massive problem considering he spent over 70% of his snaps in the slot or out wide last season. I just think Waddle, is going to have that almost Lynn Bowden role that made him relevant at the end of last year, except Waddle is obviously a hell of a lot more talented than Lynn Bowden, with no disrespect to Lynn. I like what he did with the ball. I just think Fuller, could be pigeonholed as more of a pure field stretcher. I know he can do more, but he is also missing week 1. I think him and Waddle is pretty close. Parker, unfortunately, I think is just going to struggle to get on the same page with Tua if he doesn't get a little better separating. That 2019 season Parker had was fantastic. I know he's talented. I do tend to side with my co-analyst here on the Wednesday edition of this podcast, Andrew Erickson, though, when it's like, Parker, he's really only had that one 16-game stretch with Ryan Fitzpatrick just having no one else to throw the ball to and just tossing it up to him. I'm not exactly betting on that to come back to fruition after they added these 2 speedsters. So go get Jaylen Waddle in fantasy leagues of all shapes and sizes, everybody. Couple more. Dallas Cowboys wide receiver Michael Gallup qualifies. Wide receiver 52 ADP comes in with a 99.6 target projection. I mean, last year in the first 3 games, Gallup had 24 targets and 423 air yards, which was actually more air yards than CeeDee Lamb had, even though he was at 39 targets. He wasn't too far off from Amari Cooper at 53 targets and 504 air yards. So Gallup is your, prototypical, wait for it, better in best ball wide receiver, posted 3 top 12 finishes in 2020. 2 of those were after Dak was gone for the year. So for credit to Gallup for, still playing really well, even with Andy Dalton under center. I think Gallup, unfortunately has to be a number 3 receiver in this offense because Cooper and CeeDee are that good. But make no mistake about it, people. Gallup has been anyone's idea of a great receiver since he entered the league, and he is one of the more overqualified number 3 wide receivers. Got to be careful about which offenses we think are going to enable more than 1 or 2 fantasy relevant receivers. I am confident Dak and the Cowboys can do that again. Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receiver Antonio Brown applies. ADP wide receiver 41, 0.8 target projection. So people, in 12 games with Antonio Brown last year, Godwin had 85 targets, Evans had 84, AB had 74. Godwin was the wide receiver 15 in PPR points per game. Mike Evans was the wide receiver 16. AB was the wide receiver 23. Evans and Godwin are being priced where they were last year. Brown's a good 20 spots below. He was deep into the 40s. We know he's back. We know the knee's fine. Everything is setting up for AB to, again, be, at worst, a low-end wide receiver 2. I mean, there's a non-zero chance that AB rises up and is the most productive guy here. I wouldn't bet on him. I have him ranked lower than Evans and Godwin. But one of the cool stats we found this offseason, threat rate, which is targets per route, only Devonte Adams and for some reason Braxton Berrios were targeted on a higher percentage of their routes than Antonio Brown last season. It's like a 1A, 1B, 1C situation in the Tampa Bay passing game, and that's not how they're being priced in Fantasyland. I get it if you're not a big fan of Antonio Brown, or Cole Beasley as people, but if we're just trying to win fantasy football championships, draft these guys where they're currently going. Final guy that made the list doesn't even have an ADP at the moment. That is Sterling Shepard, coming in with a whopping 106.2 target projection. I know Kenny Golladay and Kadarius Toney, they limit the ceiling for Shepard, but people, he's been a great route runner every time he's been out there. And now we're actually going to get to see him be more cozy from the friendly confines of the slot with Golden Tate out of the picture. So Shepard has historically been someone much more effective at running his routes out of the slot compared to outside. He's coming off a season where he had 7.5 targets per game. In 2019, it was 8.3. So again, Golladay and Toney are going to shrink that to an extent, but Sterling Shepard is just free at the end of drafts. And I think he's good enough where, hey, if Daniel Jones does take a step forward this year, we know Golladay is going to have a big year, but it makes sense if Shepard is the number 2 guy in this offense. So Sterling Shepard, someone that I think has always been a great real life wide receiver and always been more of a good fantasy guy. And I think, hey, where he's going, which is virtually nowhere, he can certainly beat that. So those were my main 10 guys. Quickly again, Brandin Cooks, Jarvis Landry, Cole Beasley, Jerry Judy, Will Fuller, Jaylen Waddle, Devontae Parker, Michael Gallup, Antonio Brown, and Sterling Shepard. Quickly, some honorable mention, Colts wide receivers, Michael Pittman, T.Y. Hilton. There's also Paris Campbell, Zach Pascal's going to be in there. And we even got Naeem Hines and some tight ends. It's just so crowded. I'm not super sure who we should, be expecting to rise to the top. I enjoyed what Michael Pittman did to an extent. Playoff game, he looked really good against the Bills. More times than not, though, it was just, one kind of uncovered crosser after another, making things happen after the catch. Hey, the fact he is that big and he can make good things happen with the ball in his hand is a good sign. But with TY back and Paris maybe being healthy, I'm just not so sure he gets there. So gun to my head, give me Pittman as the most productive receiver in Indy, but at cost, I'd probably take Paris over him. With the Jaguars, we have Laviska Shenault and Marvin Jones, really being pushed behind DJ Chark. And I don't know. I mean, Viska is 227 pounds. We haven't heard Urban Meyer criticize him for playing too small like he did for DJ Chark. Chark was great in 2019 when he put up that 1,000-yard season, but they brought in Jones. Every single report tells us that Viska is been the best skill position player in camp so far. I just think they're potentially going undervalued. They're being priced closer to their floor than ceiling for sure. I've been on the record saying I'm going to be an ageist this year, and I'm not believing in Marvin Jones. Where he's going cheap enough, though, I guess we can maybe consider to take some shots on him, at least, until we see how the pecking order shakes out in this offense. With the Chargers, Mike Williams somehow has, 10 touchdowns in a year, 1,000-yard season, but has never gotten even more than 90 targets. Maybe Justin Herbert actually condenses that around him, but adding Josh Palmer and some of these other guys that got at wide receiver 3, just not super convinced we see more from Mike than another just efficient season where we don't have as enough volume as we prefer. Nelson Aguilar was awesome with the Raiders last year. He could be great again with New England. 2 tight end heavy offense, but if Mac Jones wins that job quick, Aguilar could certainly be a number 1 receiver. And then finally, with the Jets, if just one of these guys wasn't here, it'd be so much easier to target them. But they're all here. Corey Davis, Elijah Moore, Keelan Cole, Denzel Mims, Jamison Crowder. I think Davis and Moore are the best guys there. They deserve to be picked first. Just realize with 5 separate wide receivers, that is tough to figure out in fantasy land. So those are some of the honorable mentions, and that's going to wrap up this edition of the PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. New episodes every single day throughout the summer. If you haven't checked it out, we got Antonio freaking Gibson on the interview. Also should be released when you're hearing this podcast here on July 9th. So make sure you check out that 10 questions with Antonio. Great stuff about his toe injury, what he anticipates his role being in 2021 as a receiver, and even just what his thoughts on Ryan Fitzpatrick and some other things. So thanks again for listening. Hopefully my voice continues to get a little better. Apologies about it in the meantime. Until next time, take care, everybody.